Hello and welcome everybody, I'm Proper Varian and this is Victoria 3's Dev Diary number 48. Today we have Unifications, and this one is of course a vital one because Unifications played such an important role in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and then of course afterwards towards World War I, the resulting countries played a huge role as well. I'm talking, in primarily here I think about Germany and Italy. However, there were many more unifications going on. This system tries to capture them all as good as it can, and I think what we're going to be seeing here in this dev diary is significantly superior compared to Victoria 2's system, which isn't difficult. I don't mean to basically dunk on Victoria 2. It's just low-hanging fruit because the game was done in a much shorter time frame by a much smaller team. But this system tries to be more generalized and tries to learn from the mistakes of the sphering mechanic that Victoria 2 has applied. I will tell you right now, as a sort of conclusion that I have drawn after reading it, I think this system overall gameplay-wise is great. It sounds really involved, it sounds really good. I think when it comes to historical authenticity, we're talking about something that might have some shortcomings. Let's jump in and let's find out what I might mean. Today's topic will be unification, aka the process of turning one nation into another greater nation, such as the historical example of the Kingdom of Prussia turning into the German Empire in 1871. And talking about unification, there are two distinct types of unifications: regular unifications and major unifications, the latter of which have some special mechanics associated with them. We'll go over the former first. Right, so this is a normal unification, you can see it right here. This is Baluchistan and India. I'm not sure whether India maybe counts as a special unification, but Baluchistan most certainly is just, you basically go in there and you form Baluchistan and that is it. You can see right here we are playing in India, our culture and religion are Baluchi and Sunni, but that is quite interesting indeed. So this is a normal unification. A regular unification is, plain and simple, a particular country that can be formed by other countries. These may be countries that have existed in the past, such as Poland, came into being after 1836, such as Italy. But I have to say, by the way, Italy is not a normal unification, it's actually a major unification, but more on that later. Our old history countries that we have deemed plausible or interesting enough to include, such as Arabia, or may even be countries that already existed on the map in 1836, but can be reformed if they were to break up or be conquered, such as the United Provinces of Central America. So the UPCA is a very, very obvious case here, because they actually existed, fell apart, and then you might try to refound them. However, I gotta tell you, I wish that this sort of refounding thing was viable for basically any situation. I would really like it if, if you look at, for example, Kaiserreich, the way that mod in Hearts of Iron 4 deals with defeating France in World War II as Germany, you get the choice to basically break France down into its constituent countries, such as, Normandy, Brittany, and so on, Aquitaine, and so on. And that is an interesting dynamic, because if you were to do it with a coalition of nations against France, or against any other nation really, it would be neat if those splinters could then attempt to reform France, but that is just the cherry on top, so not really something to consider too much. There are a few conditions that must be met before a country can form another. So again, this is the normal unification. The forming country must share at least one primary culture with the unification country. For example, if you have South or North German primary culture, you can form Germany. Makes a lot of sense. The forming country must have a lower country tier than the unification country. Country tier is an inherent status assigned to each country based on how it was historically perceived, and gives prestige based on how high the tier is. For example, a country that was historically regarded as a kingdom gets a bit more prestige than one that was a mere county. This is a fairly weak effect, as the idea that some countries and titles are simply more inherently prestigious than others was falling out of fashion in the game's era, but serves as a useful way to determine which countries would realistically strive to change their identities, as it's quite unlikely that Poland would want to turn itself into just Galicia-Volhynia, while Krakow might jump at that opportunity. There's one exception to this rule. A country may form a major unification of the same tier if they are themselves not already a country that counts as a major unification. For example, the Empire of Austria can become the Empire of Germany, despite not increasing their tier in the process. Very long paragraph. We already knew that country tiers are important for prestige purposes. This is how you form a higher tier. That is the standard process. You press the button after you conquer that entire area, and then you are good to go. I find it interesting, of course, that Austria can form Germany. I mean, that is a major unification, so you don't go up a tier there, but the major unification is so much more important that they want you to get involved either way. I do wonder what formables there are, and I do wonder how dynamic those formables will actually be. I mean, for example, how do you determine Germany's flag? Do they check who formed it? because, man, that would be so many flag variations. Because I have to tell you, I gotta tell you, the flag, of course, that became the German Empire's flag was a flag chosen because of the historical context of the North German Federation. That is Prussia, and of course the Hanseatic cities. If Austria were to form it, that wouldn't be the same flag. If Bavaria were to form it, that wouldn't be the same flag. If you form it as a democracy, I mean, but that is already involved there. Either way, this is something that I would be very interested in, whether the country checks who forms it and then chooses a flag pool, whether that is something that is viable. The forming country must also own or be the suzerain of their owner of a sufficient number of the integral state regions of the unification country. So basically, you need to hold the big chunk of the actual country. Makes a lot of sense. Certain unifications may require you to research technologies such as nationalism or pan-nationalism to actually be available. These requirements are, I think, very, very classic. They're very normal, very standard. You need to be of the right culture, you need to be a lower tier, or if it's a major unification, you don't actually need to be a lower tier. And then, of course, you need to make sure that you are actually in control. You can't just call yourself Italy or Germany by, you know, doing it. I mean, you technically could, but it wouldn't actually get acknowledged. Very interesting dynamic there as well, but nothing here that is actually surprising. Once these conditions are achieved, unification is as simple as the press of a button. Once that button is pressed, the forming countries will immediately turn into the unification country, annexing any subjects of theirs that share a primary culture with the unification country and own land in its integral state regions in the process. For this reason, it isn't necessarily required or even desirable to outright conquer other countries that are standing in the way of your unification dreams. Subjugating them lets you count their land towards the required goal and allows you to integrate them into your unified country with less infamy than you would otherwise get. This is good. I will always welcome this. Instead of just pure map painting, you can just vassal paint basically and then still get the outcome. Now here we come to a point where I have to say I don't think this system captures this particular unification style too well. And ultimately that is an issue I think that will persist until well after launch, because this would be an issue for an update. This would be an issue that has to be added in some form or another. Let's take a look at what I mean. With 7 of the 9 integral Australian state regions under their control, New South Wales are ready to proclaim themselves as the United Dominion of Australia. This is not how that worked. Okay, let's take a look first here. North Island is split and South Island split. I think this means Australia can actually become Oceania, basically, by adding New Zealand to the fold. Did New South Wales, or for that matter, any state, any region of Australia, gain the upper hand and then they founded Australia? The answer is, of course, no. This is not how that worked. This is not how it worked in Australia. This is not how it worked in Canada. And I realize... So this is why I'm saying this is a fairly trivial complaint, but it is a complaint that I want to lodge nonetheless. I realize that this is very specific to colonial nations of the Commonwealth, but these nations basically were a consensus unification. They said, we would like self-governance. Westminster said, God, thank you. I'm so tired of having to rule and lord over you. And then they would go on and unify. They would hold votes on it, it would be consensus-based, and there you go. Obviously, that is insanely specific. Unifications here are a generalized system, as they often do. I've heard this a lot, of course, from CK3 devs, for example, where they say we don't want to develop a system where a lot of work goes into it, and then it is only used by a single tag, by a single region. We want more generalized systems. For example, the Iberian struggle is applicable to so many other regions as a system, right? It is a very general system. They clearly made a generalized system here. I just think the Commonwealth unification process of consensus-based unification, and this includes as well how you would unify Germany if the Crown from the Gutter were a thing. I don't believe the Crown from the Gutter will be a thing in Victoria 3 at launch, but that also would be a largely consensus-based unification of the country. That isn't in here. New South Wales is supreme in Australia and all of a sudden can form Australia. Again, not at all. It really misses the point of the Commonwealth unifications and how they went on. It also misses the point, of course, of the vassal-overlord relationship. New South Wales vassalizing or conquering the other parts of Australia. It just doesn't really make much sense, right? That is the major issue there, but that is something I think that extends itself even further. We already know, for example, that if you turn Canada into a communist country, Great Britain will basically say, okay, as long as you're still my vassal, all that is cool, and that doesn't make any sense. I hope you get where I'm coming from there. Maybe you can disagree, you can agree, but yeah, this is one of the things where I have to say this is so specific. I don't mind that it doesn't fit it, but Very clear these colonial unifications don't fit into this bill at all. Right, so now let's move on from the regular unifications to the actual major unifications. How do major unifications differ? Quite a bit, actually. Major unifications are countries such as Germany and Italy, which historically had strong nationalist movements agitating for their creation from the disparate polities they were divided into. Once any country sharing a primary culture with a unification country researches the nationalism society tech, new mechanics called unification candidates and unification diplomatic plays come into effect. I am a big fan of this mechanic on a gameplay level. I think this will produce an insanely interesting mechanic to interact with for a good 20 to 30 years, and if you think about it, that is more than a quarter of the entire time within the game. I say this because I think that in Victoria 2, of course, you had a system with the sphering, you had a system that went on when it came to the actual fighting, but it was heavily historically railroaded, basically, right? You needed to go, of course, to Schleswig-Holstein, you needed to go against Austria, and you needed to go against France, period. That's the way it is. You can't ask any questions, and on top of that, you have a very annoying sphering system, because you constantly need to interact with it. It's like cookie clicker, very, very annoying, and you, as the sphered country, can't do much. Gameplay sucks. Historically, very authentic. It has to be said, Victoria 2 quite authentic there, but again, very railroady, and that is not necessarily good. Victoria 3, not really authentic. You're gonna see why in a second, I think. And when it comes to gameplay, though, much, much, much better. It sounds so interesting for both the unifying country and the country at risk of being unified into the other country. Let's take a look at how this actually goes. Unification candidates are, quite simply, countries that aspire to unify the aforementioned disparate polities under a single flag. The clear historical example here being the Kingdom of Prussia's ambition to unify Germany. In order for a country to be a unification candidate, the country must at least be a major power. However, if there are other potential or current unification candidates that are great powers, then major powers are not considered to be valid unification candidates, as they are simply seen as too weak by comparison. I like the idea where I could technically, let's say I'm Austrian, let's say I see these Italians and they're trying to unify, but I hold, of course, Lombardy and Venice. And all of a sudden they say that should be Italian land. Well, to quote Metternich, we have to make sure that these lands and that Italy as a term remains a geographical term. What could you do? You could technically just destroy Sardinia-Piedmont, the papacy, two Sicilies. You could destroy them enough so that they can't be major powers. If nobody in Italy is a major power, there can't be a unification, and the quote-unquote balance, the Austrian rule, is guaranteed. Super interesting field. I think it's a super interesting gameplay dynamic, because to stop Italian unification, you wouldn't have to conquer all of it, you just have to weaken the Italian states enough so that they can't even attempt it. I like this a lot. I also think I understand why they say if there is a great power that is a candidate, being a major power doesn't qualify you. It actually disqualifies you. You need to be at least a great power. I wonder about this, because I do, you know, let's say you play Bavaria, let's say if there is a South German Federation that you can unify into, let's say you unify into this, you could potentially be in a situation where you can't actually unify the country, despite being pretty much as similar of a candidate as Prussia as well. I would like to see this in action, but that's honestly mostly a balancing concern. Let's be real, that is just day-to-day politics in its concept, or rather as a concept, this is really, really cool. There can be up to 3 unification candidates at any given time, and if there are more potential candidates than this, then the 3 with the highest prestige are chosen. It is also possible for there to simply be no unification candidates at all if no potential formant is at least a major power. That's what I was talking about when it comes to Italy. Russia and Austria each have a handful of supporters for their bid to unify Germany, but most of the minor German countries remain uncommitted. So this screen is super interesting. Launch a unification play, we're going to see that in a second. Form Germany is just a button to actually form it. Then we have Prussia and Austria. These are the only unification candidates because, mind you, it's logical, there are no other great powers in this land. Maybe Bavaria makes it to a major power, maybe Baden does as well, but most certainly in this situation, since if you have a great power involved, only other great powers can be unification candidates, these are the only 2 that exist. There can be a max of 3, and these are currently the only 2. You could launch a leadership play against Austria and actually knock them out, making it so that you would be the only unification candidate which is required to actually launch this play up here. Now this right here, I think they are... I'm pretty sure these are listed based on how much prestige they have, based on their rank. Because this is Prussia, this is Austria, then Bavaria, Baden, Hanover. wherever you are, Luxembourg, right? Mecklenburg, I believe this is Schleswig-Holstein, if I'm not mistaken, Hamburg, right? All these folks exist here, and I wish they were sorted in blocks, so that I don't have to see, oh, who supports Austria? It's Bavaria, this, and this, right? Who supports Prussia? I wish they were sorted by temporary allegiance and by non-committal. I think that would be better to glean the information that you really want. You don't want to know about who could be a candidate if they became a great power. That's very unrealistic. Instead, I would like it if they actually assembled based on who they support. I thought that actually with the... I played a lot of Stellaris recently, and I thought that as well with the Galactic community there. Paradox seems to have a bit of a habit to just say, let's just sort them based on strength. With the Galactic community, for example, I would like it if they assembled them in rough, ideological blocks. So that I can see these are very likely to support me, so that I can guess the actual numbers before I ever commit to anything, right? The actual support numbers, and I would like to see the same here. Either way, this is the screen, and then we got the German states. Of course, Alsace-Lorraine is French, this is all Prussian, and then down here we got Austrian lands. This is an interesting screen. Let's take a look and learn about what you can do with it. Most importantly, once you are a unification candidate, you can now begin to receive the support of non-candidate countries sharing a primary culture with a unification country, aka any country which has the potential to be a candidate but doesn't make the cut. As you can see right here, the unification country in this case would be Germany. That means we're looking at North German and South German. Everybody that is North or South German can actually be involved in this. I believe this is probably why... Switzerland, right? I think Swiss gets Swiss culture, and I think they did this so that it wouldn't be included in here, because otherwise you would always see a truly abhorrent Switzerland, and the actual unification of Germany with Switzerland was so unheard of. It was so unlikely that there was a minority of extreme German nationalists basically arguing for it, but largely it was a dismissed notion. Switzerland had gained independence from the German sphere, I think from the German political sphere, way earlier, so quite uninvolved. That is the point behind this, I think. These countries then can instead choose to throw their weight behind one of the existing candidates, effectively telling the world that they would like to become a part of something greater than themselves. For the purposes of holding the necessary number of integral state regions, any unification candidate gets to hold the land held by countries supporting them. So, if both the Mecklenburgian duchies back Prussia's candidacy, this means that Prussia gets to count Mecklenburg towards the number of North-South German state regions they need. Meaning, you don't need to conquer them, you just need to persuade them. I like that a lot. Furthermore, unification candidates get access to 2 special diplomatic plays, which can be launched from the Nation Formation panel. These are called National Leadership and Unification, and are modeled largely on the historical process by which Germany came into being. This sentence is something I take issue with. I like this system, I said it already, I love this system gameplay-wise. It sounds so dynamic, and you're going to see in a second as well what you can do if you're not a candidate, but this is definitely not how Germany was founded. There are some dynamics here that this system is blind to, both in Germany's case and in Italy's case. We're going to see that in a second. National leadership is only relevant if there are multiple unification candidates, and is effectively one candidate challenging another for supremacy, as happened in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. This play always targets another unification candidate, with both sides having as a primary war goal to force the other to renounce their candidacy. Supporters come into play here, as any country pledged to support one candidate or the other will automatically back them in the play, fight on their side should things escalate into war. This makes perfect sense. National leadership play, this is how it was. This is how it went. You said you had allies, you had enemies, and these would then stand with one another during the war. For example, Hanover, of course, got annexed by Prussia. Keep that in mind. In this exact play, Austria was defeated at Königgrätz, and then we are looking at a situation where all of a sudden Prussia is, of course, the only person in a situation to actually unify. Here we have a bit of a different screen. Earlier we had Prussia with only 5 supporters, now they have 17, so the vast majority of countries here now are behind them. And interestingly enough, I believe this is actually a screenshot from before Queen Victoria comes into power. You can see right here, this is Hanover after it breaks up with Great Britain, and this is during the reign of, I believe, George III. Right? Either way, you can launch a Diplo play here, and this play will kick Austria out of the candidate position if you were to win. All the backers are your supporters, all the backers are Austria supporters, and then Netherlands and Switzerland might get involved. I believe, again, this is before it even gets unpaused, I think. They must have just cheated the numbers in as you do for these screenshots. I mean, it's just to showcase something, right? Because we're looking at a situation where France, Russia apparently don't care, and I think that is largely just because, well, yeah, ultimately we're looking at a situation where they aren't getting involved. Or maybe, is this a war where outside powers can't get involved? No, actually, they can get involved. Netherlands and Switzerland, neither of them are actually valid members of this play. Interesting nonetheless. To see this, I think this is a perfect... This encapsulates what happened perfectly. When a leadership war goal is enforced, the defeated party will become permanently disqualified as a unification candidate, which also lowers the maximum numbers of candidates for that unification country by 1. In other words, if Prussia defeats Austria, as happened historically, then Austria will no longer be a unification candidate, and unless another German country, such as Bavaria, has been able to rise to great power status, Prussia will be left as the sole candidate standing. Makes sense. It's important to note that Austria being disqualified from candidacy for Germany does not actually prevent them from ever forming Germany, but it does mean they can no longer use the tools available to candidates and so would have to rely on brute force to achieve that end, because none of this would be accessible to Austria anymore. Nobody could support them, would be counted in it, and then have a leadership play. No, you are out, you either conquer them all, you basically vassalize them all, or you can't form it. I like this, I think this is fine. Once you win this contest, remember the game is only 100 years long, that should be it. This is one of the most pivotal moments that can happen in any Wiki game. When there's only one candidate, either because there was only one to begin with, or all others have been defeated, the unification play can be used. This is a special play that involves every non-great power country that shares a primary culture with a unification country and owns land in its integral state regions. Right, so this means Austria won't be annexed. Wouldn't this mean in reverse? Obviously it makes sense. Austria can't be annexed via this play, because it doesn't involve, it involves every non-great power country. Surely you could afterwards still try to get the German areas of Austria by having your own wars, because they count as your homelands, right? But I'm thinking about it. If Austria... Man, that is an interesting... I like this, actually, the more I think about it. I didn't consider this when I read this text the first time around, but... This means that if Austria wins the leadership play, and then starts a unification play, it would unify everything but Prussia. Right? Prussia would remain independent. Every non-great power country. For Austria to achieve Mega Germany, you have to downgrade Prussia to a major power. That's basically what this says. Very, very reminiscent of how you would do it in Victoria 2. Very, very reminiscent. You can see the inspiration here, I think. But it is much more flexible, of course, with the way it actually works. As before, any of these countries that support the candidate will automatically be on their side in the play, while all others, regardless of who they might have supported or not supported in the past, will be on the opposing side, with the strongest among them as war leader. Just as with any other diplomatic play, including national leadership, any country with an interest in the region where it's taking place may butt in. Right, so this is confirmation. This is where I have to say, as a whole, this is not how German unification went. German unification, yes, the Brothers' War, that is showcased in the leadership play right here. Perfectly showcased. I think it's a great application of this game system. But the unification of the German Empire as a whole, you have to consider that in 1870, Bavaria, Baden, and so on, Württemberg, they have no interest in actually joining a German Empire. They want to remain independent. What really swept them in was the common defensive cause against France, the war that was provoked, of course, by Prussia, and then France took the bait, was defeated, and within the dynamic that is sort of unleashed when you have such a national fervor moment, such as this one, the Great War against France, it is very difficult to deny yourself this sort of a struggle, right? The unification of Germany in that moment. Unification ultimately occurred because they managed to wrap themselves into this moment of national fervor against an outside enemy. In this case, somebody that held German-conceived territory, or conceptualized territory, Alsace-Lorraine. The issue with this system as it is here is that yes, an outside force might get involved, but on a fundamental level. This unification play exists between a German country and other German countries. And that's kind of odd. That is as if in 1870, Prussia said, we're gonna march into Bavaria. And then France said, we're gonna defend Bavaria, and then wrap it up, everything ends in Versailles, and the Kaiser is crowned. That's not at all a good depiction of how Germany was unified. It's not a good depiction of how Italy was unified either, mind you. Italy was a much more like consensus-based, if you will, because of the Garibaldi situation, but at the same time, it also primarily was a unification by saying, we unify by kicking out a foreign force, by unifying the lands that are currently under suppression there. This aspect of the foreign force saying, I want you to never unify, which is why I'm here, which is why I hold these lands, and you saying this foreign force threatens us, this entire aspect is not here. I didn't enjoy the way Victoria 2 did it, by railroading you into always going for Alsace-Lorraine. It's too much railroading, I think. Can form Germany, realistically speaking, without Alsace-Lorraine. Would it be possible, right? But I think this play sort of misjudges whether the actual unification was an internal conflict or not. I like it gameplay-wise. I said this before, and let me quickly just justify this. I like it gameplay-wise because even if you lose the leadership play, even if you lose that, you're still in a position where you could then deny the unification via the unification play. I am not against that at all. I just think that this system doesn't actually fit the bill as far as the unifications that we have in Europe are concerned. Still, very, very good gameplay system in my opinion. I just think it sort of misses the point of the later wars in the Italian and the German unification. In a unification play, the attacker is angling for no less than the full annexation of all other non-great power countries on the potential target list, including their own supporters. As such, it may seem like there is little reason for a country who isn't a unification candidate themselves to support a candidate, but assuming your goal is an annexation of your own country, there is one valid reason to do so, to play for time. Supporting a unification candidate is very likely to make them friendlier towards you, which means that if you're playing as Anhalt, surrounded on all sides by Prussia, it can be a valid strategy to throw your support behind them to avoid an intervention in your country and abandon that support once you've secured some strong allies. This is what I mean gameplay-wise. I like this. You can suppose Prussia in the candidate play, and then later on abandon them, get some outside allies, try to stop the unification. I get this from a player point of view. It's just, it just feels so, it ignores the international notion of why the war against France and against Austria for Italy were necessary. They were necessary because we were looking at a situation where, of course, you have to unify people, you have to get the national fervor going to then unify them into one country. That's completely absent here. You can see it right here as well, the Unified Germany Diplo play the targets, they're German states, right? It also is, of course, it's just so unsatisfying to basically see Hanover, because Hanover should be annexed. Hanover, or well, you know, it is one of those things where they already should be on your side. If they were, for example, on the side of Austria in the early diplomatic play, they should now mandatorily be on your side. And it's so interesting, yet again, that Prussia has Bavaria's support to unify the country. Obviously, this is something that you do in play. If you persuade, you know, Bavaria to join you, then it's logical that they are your backer. But I'm just saying that this diplomatic play, to actually have the unification, technically you could do this. You could press them so much that they don't even go to war. You just have a peaceful unification. Then France just watched. You know, like, yeah, I don't know. I would really... I'm basically saying I would enjoy it if instead we were looking at a situation where it took into account how important these countries not being unified was to outside countries, right? This was a major driving direction for Great Britain, for France, for Austria, for Russia, as far as Germany and Italy are concerned. This doesn't seem to play a role here at all. You need to basically destroy the internal opposition, and then you destroy the internal opposition again, which is this right here, right? I think gameplay-wise, this is great if you play one of the smaller nations. I think they actually make it interesting to play them, which is something that you can't say about Victoria 2. I just think you know, ultimately, this is something where I wish it was solved in a bit of a different way. I don't know what way, I have to admit. I don't know how. Gameplay-wise, I think this is A+. This is really great. I don't enjoy it from a historical authenticity point of view. Either way, this was this dev diary. Let me know what you think about it. And in the next one, we will be hearing about characters. Very interested in this one. And, I mean, I'll leave you here. I'll see you later, alligator.